We consider so much of our reactive process and the emotional responses that we have to the outward stressors and triggers in our lives to be something that are fixed, to be something that we don't have control to change, because here is this outward external circumstance that's coming and impacting my life. And therefore, I'm subservient to reacting to it. However, what we learn through the process of meditation and what science is finally catching up to show us is that this in fact is not true, that the brain is constantly evolving. And part of that is our social emotional reactions and our ability to foster compassion, creativity, joy, happiness, calmness, these states of being that bring us to a place of deeper peace, deeper awareness, and ultimately an uplifted state of superconsciousness. In my classroom, as a high school English teacher, one of the things that I always used to practice and still do practice at times is what's called the philosophy of growth mindset. And growth mindset was first created or first discovered, so to speak, or made popular by a woman named Carol Dweck, who was a research educator, who essentially found what might feel obvious to us to begin with, that students who were put in circumstances where they felt a fear of failure, whether it was in a test or an activity or even a social interaction that they were having with a peer, if they felt this impending fear of failure, then their mind contracted, then their spirit contracted, and suddenly they felt fixed and locked into this mindset of being frozen, of being afraid of failure, of being afraid of producing the right skill, of being afraid of not being good enough. And what it caused was this inability or this lack of desire to actually try and stretch their mind, to stretch their abilities. And of course, the opposite of that, what this researcher came to find, is that when you put a student into a circumstance where failure isn't an option, simply because the foundation of the educational pedagogy is that everything is evolutionary, and a skill that's being practiced on one day may not be mastered that day, but it may be mastered in another day, a week, a month, a year. But that student, failure doesn't exist because that student is on an evolutionary trajectory that's pulling them up toward ultimate mastery over whatever the academic skill may be, the social interaction may be, or whatever other process of self-discovery they are interacting with in those moments. And what we find, and what I found in my own classroom when I practiced this philosophy, is that when a student is in a state of positivism, when a student is in a state that is expanded and free, where they don't feel that contraction from fear or from inadequacy, then suddenly there's an adaptability, a malleability, a flexibility to what they are able to actually produce, the skills that their mind is actually able to grasp, because suddenly there's a sense of freedom and expansion. This sounds pretty familiar when we come back to the practice of meditation, doesn't it? Because what we begin to find is that when we cultivate these states of uplifted consciousness in our own mind, then we are enhancing our well-being holistically, body, mind, soul, on every level and in every aspect. And success becomes redefined by that measurement of the trajectory of evolving. Suddenly we begin to see that where we were today doesn't necessarily mean that's where we'll be tomorrow, that we can always come back and try again. And of course, the way that this relates to the states of consciousness that are cultivated in meditation comes back to that reality of being able to practice positivism, to bring ourselves into a state of calmness, of peace, of expansion, so that we too can generate that sense of inner peace, and suddenly we're not being impacted by the world, but rather we're impacting it. That even if we're in a circumstance that is frustrating or difficult or challenging, instead of being brought down into that contracted state, we're uplifted, we're able to expand, we're able to be solution-oriented in the midst of everything that we're learning or everything that we're experiencing. And the truth of this is that we can practice this state of consciousness, and the brain begins to evolve with us. The more that we invite these uplifted states through meditation and through our daily practice of breaking those habits of tension and contraction, then suddenly we find that we're moving through the world in that uplifted state, more and more consciously, and that we're sharing that with others. Paramahansa Yogananda, when talking about habits, he says that the reformation of habits, or the adaptation of habits, to introduce a new habit, whether rapidly or slowly, it depends on things like our condition of health and overall well-being, and on the methods and techniques that we're using, whether it's affirmation or other forces of willpower that we can use in order to cultivate those states of higher awareness and those states of positivity. But he also says that it depends on the condition of the brain cells and of the nervous system. Because you see, the brain is something that's pliable, it's malleable, it's growing and evolving with us every single day. In a book that is called The Instinct to Heal, written by, I want to get the author's name correct here, written by David Schierven-Schieberg, he talks about how when we recall states of positive memory, when we recall something that brought us joy, not in a sense of nostalgia and longing, but in that sense of true joy and freedom and upliftment. And when we cultivate and remember those states, if we are in the midst of a busy, stressful day, and we just take 10 minutes to calm the breath and bring to mind those uplifted, happy memories, then what happens is our heart rate variability begins to change. The heart rate begins to slow down, and we enter into a phase which is called coherence. And in this stage of coherence, when the heart rate has slowed down and the breath is also coaxing the nervous system to relax, then suddenly what we find is that our emotional well-being, that the emotional state of the brain begins to foster a sense of stability, a sense of safety, and a feeling that everything is going to be okay. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So all we have to do is just take a moment to close the eyes, relax, and bring to mind those sensations that draw to us experiences of expansion, receptivity, joy, calmness, positivism, and suddenly the body responds to that. And here we are, and the brain responds to that, and we feel safe. We feel that everything's going to be okay. We feel a sense of stability and of trust. And it's in those moments that the brain is actually changing, that we're rewiring and reworking the brain. We're drawing new pathways that bring us closer and closer to that uplifted state, so that the next time we drop down into a sense of stress or frustration, there's actually already a pathway that's carved out for us to return up to that state of upliftment. And it's such a beautiful thing for us, because this is the reality of the fact that the brain does actually change. And all it takes is something, it's very sweet. He calls it his 10-minute healing practice, 10 minutes of recalling a beautiful memory, 10 minutes of sitting by a lake and listening to the birds, 10 minutes of watching a sunset, anything that brings us into that state of awareness that there is a reality much larger than ourselves. And when the brain is actually changing, so to come back to this fact that the brain is actually in a state of transformation when we are recollecting these positive qualities or these positive attributes in our lives, then the brain changes on 3 different levels. The 3 main ways that the brain can change is through the chemical, structural, or foundational pathways. And the chemical pathway is more superficial. It's when these signals between the neurons are changed or are fired. And so that's sort of, it's not something that's deeply grooved in or rooted, but it's something that just has a momentary change. These are things like our motor skills. So again, the way that we would think, if I want to go out and run a marathon, I'm going to start running just little increments at a time, and then over time continue to extend that length of time that I'm running, continue to strengthen the heart, to strengthen the muscles. Or if I want to learn a new instrument, I may practice scales or may practice exercises that are going to help with the dexterity of my fingers. And all of those, what I'm doing in those moments is I'm drawing on, I'm building on this transformation on this chemical level in the brain, where suddenly there are these signals that are being fired between the neurons. And the next level of change in the brain is, again, what we call structural. And structural changes in the brain are a little bit deeper, and this is where the connection between neurons, so we're beginning to build deeper grooves in the transformation of the brain. Just as we were talking about, when I cultivate states of peace and calmness, I'm building pathways that are grooved into that, to the brain, so that I can come back and recall that state of mind again, and I can find that place of peace, of happiness. I can practice these states of higher awareness that keep us uplifted and keep us feeling joyful. And the last stage, which is the most interesting for what we're talking about here in terms of rewiring the brain, is what we call functional changes. And a functional change is where we are enlivening or lighting up a particular region of the brain. And the more that we light up that region of the brain, the more that we give our focus and our concentration and our energy to any one region in the brain, the easier it is to access that region again and again. So for somebody who is a long-time meditator, or even a new meditator who's meditating 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, 90 minutes a day, whatever it may be, we're cultivating energy, we're firing up, we're enlivening the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the anterior insula, all of these parts of the brain which are helping to cultivate those states of expansion and of higher awareness, of ultimately what we call superconscious states of awareness. And the more that we practice that, the more that I sit down to meditate day after day, the stronger my ability is to come back to and enliven that region of the brain again. This is why when studies are done on long-time yogis who have been meditating for decades, we can find that often there are certain parts of their brains that are always enlivened, that never turn off, because they've cultivated that over time. The energy is firing there, and they've actually changed their brain waves. They've actually changed the pathways through which they interact with the world and the parts of the brain that they use when they're interacting with the world. What would it mean to open our heart and to move through the world with our heart first, as someone like our spiritual teacher, Swami Ananda, did? Or what would it mean to always bring our energy and our attention to the point between the eyebrows and to move to the world, to react to the world from that place of the prefrontal cortex, to enliven this region of the brain so that we're working with solution-oriented mentalities first, with expansive mentalities first, that we're seeking out calmness and peace before we're seeking out anxiety and fear. This is what we're doing as we're rewiring and we're reworking those pathways. And so you see, our emotional well-being is ultimately in our control, because we have the ability, just as we can train for a marathon and stretch the skill of the muscle and stretch the endurance of the heart, we can also train the brain through meditation to actually transform itself, to actually change along with us, to cultivate those states of higher awareness, so that suddenly happiness, adaptability, flexibility, these aren't states that we are reacting to. They're not states that are fixed in our mindset, but they're states that we can draw upon in any given moment. And that is ultimately what brings us to that greater sense of freedom. As we begin to rewire the brain and we begin to regroove those pathways, our habits transform. Just as Paramahansa Yogananda tells us in the quote that I was referencing from the beginning, it's not just health and well-being and the techniques that we're using that help us to transform our habits, but it's also the very brain cells with which we're working. Because when we are bringing energy to those regions that are in fact expansive, then we live more in that expansive state of awareness. And the last place that I want to go today, let me just check my time to make sure I'm okay. The last place that I want to go today is to come back to what that actually looks like in our own lives. And what this looks like for each one of us in our own lives. There's a beautiful study that was done with a group of Tibetan monks, and they had a collective number of about I think it was 34,000 hours of meditation together in this group of 8 monks that was being studied. And one of the monks very beautifully described, he was asked, what does it feel like when you are meditating? And he described that state of meditation as a state where love and compassion permeated his entire mind. And that state brings us to a place of generosity. And what this study was showing was that when we live in a state of generosity, we're actually shifting the brain waves in our mind. And this is what Dana Lynn Anderson was speaking about a little bit earlier today with gamma synchronicity. Suddenly the brain waves are beginning to oscillate on this level, they're not alpha or delta or theta, they're oscillating as gamma waves in terms of this gamma synchronicity, which invites creative states of receptivity, which invites creative states of expansion into our lives. And so suddenly what they were finding is that when we are living in that state of generosity, that's what the study was calling it, I would call it of inner expansion, in that state of feeling our oneness and our unity with all the world, with everything around us, with all of creation, then the brain is actually more receptive and susceptible to changing. It becomes more plastic. It becomes more flexible. And so suddenly, the more that we are able to bring that state of inner meditation, that state of awareness, of calmness and peace and joy into our lives through our meditation practices, and then through the very way in which we move through the world with a more compassionate lens, a more expansive lens, then what we find is the brain is more willing to adapt and to be receptive to the training, so to speak, that we're giving it, to the training that we're giving it to always be uplifted. So that we find when we're moving through the world, it's much easier to access those states of adaptability. So that suddenly when we're coming up against something at work, we don't have to choose anger, aggression, or stress. We can choose calmness. Whether it's coming back to a 10-minute healing of closing the eyes, using the breath to calm down the nervous system, imagining something beautiful, whether it's a few rounds of a meditation technique that you know, whatever it may be that brings us to those states of calmness, that's what we begin to find. The brain becomes more receptive to it. It becomes hungry for that change. It's longing for that change. So what we find is when we begin to work the muscles just a little bit, then suddenly the muscle wants to take on more. It becomes more receptive to that weight that we're lifting, and the brain is no different. When we feed the brain just a touch of what it means to be more adaptable, to be more open to change, then suddenly it wants more and more of that, and it's more receptive to it. Which is, of course, what the yogis have told us for millennia. The more that we can meditate, this is what happens in the Festival of Light, which is a celebration of the soul's journey that we read each week at Ananda. Even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings, as the Gita tells us, as the Bhagavad Gita says. And so what we've been taught for millennia from the great yogis is now being supported with the science that we have to show that the brain wants to change, that the brain wants to adapt, that it wants to cultivate these states of joy, that it's more receptive to states of joy and upliftment than it is to states of negativity and contraction. So whether we're placed in a situation, as I do with my students, where I say failure is not an option, we're just here to grow and expand, or whether we're just every single day saying, how can I be more generous and compassionate? How can I think of others rather than thinking about myself? Every little thing that we're doing is actually creating a new pathway in the brain that's bringing us closer and closer to that state of ultimate bliss and joy, and that state of union with all of creation, which is, of course, where we meet in that crossroads of science and of the science and ancient teachings. It's what we're doing in meditation. So I invite all of us to continue to try this, to uplift our hearts, to uplift our energy, and to practice cultivating these states, to enliven and fire those regions of the brain that are going to help us to be super consciously aware and awake in the world.